All right, we just posted our GIF animations. That was assignment 3. So now we are moving away from compositing with other people's pixels. And we are moving towards not doing pixel-based images at all, but instead doing vector-based images. So we move to Unit 9. We are still going to do your group presentations. That's Unit 8. But all of you know what your topics are and you're working on that. So our next assignment is assignment 4. And assignment 4 has, as part of its development, as part of its process requirements, to do sketches. And we call those sketches Proving Ground number 2. So that's what I'm going to introduce to you today. What the assignment is, and then how you're going to sketch for it and turn in those sketches for Proving Ground number 2. It also has a question of the day starting this unit off. Because as we move from raster images that we were just compositing with, pixel-based images, to vector images, it's important to know the difference between them. So the question of the day is pretty simple, if you know what vectors and raster are, and it's what advantages does vector-based imagery have over raster-based imagery? What are its disadvantages? The only reason we have both types of digital images is because they're good for different things, right? So when would using a vector-based image be more effective than a pixel-based image? And I'll give you one example. So if I'm making a t-shirt design for someone, and I do it with pixels, right? The cleaner I want the image to look, the more memory it has to take. So these are just circles, black circles made with pixels, right? As soon as we get below 72 by 72 pixels, which is screen resolution, right? 72 pixels per inch. On the screen, you can start to see the distortion of those pixels. But even at 600 by 600, it's not like we see an edge that's perfectly clean. Because pixels are always squares. And you can't do clean curves with squares. You can just make really, really small squares. But if I do the design instead as a vector, then the file will always have the same amount of memory. And no matter how large I make it, it will always be perfectly clean curves. Because vectors are not based on square pixels. They're based on paths that are straight lines or curves between vector anchor points. So you can see this is a high resolution pixel image done as a 300, it should be pixels per inch, but these are examples from a book. And you can get a pretty clean image on a t-shirt doing it at 300 pixels per inch, but it's going to look cleanest when you do it as a vector, with the included advantage that the vector will take up less memory and can be used for much larger projects. So not just a shirt, but also like a billboard, also the side of a truck, also signage that takes up the whole side of a skyscraper, right? All from the same file. And of course, if you try to print at resolution that's too low, it's going to be the worst. So we have low resolution, high resolution, but the best of all is always going to be vector for clarity. Now that is if you're doing one color, right? So this is especially true for black line art. And that is very common in t-shirt design. If your client only wants to pay for one color ink, then you want to do it as a vector. So I have a whole Google Slides here for you about the differences between vector and raster images. I start with this video that one of my first digital honors students made. And it's unusual for me in my classes to get a student that has a lot of experience with vectors. And especially this student was unusual. They were taking my class for a second time as a digital honors student, but they actually preferred vectors to raster images, right? So they wanted to make their animation as vector. And this was back when we were using Flash Animate, Adobe Flash, which is a vector animation program, which has gone out of style now because it's not supported on phones or tablets. But let's start by just watching this student's video. which was his mentorship presentation, explaining the difference between vectors and raster images. And because it's older, it's from around 2011, he's using the old name for raster files, which people sometimes call bitmaps. They don't do that anymore because bitmap means something else. And that's why I kind of redefined bitmap as raster here. But everything else makes sense.
Bitmaps versus vector graphics. Bitmaps are a collection or an array of bits, which are also known as pixels. Up until now, this is likely the only kind of graphic you've ever worked with. However, there is another. Vector graphics are paths which are plotted through mathematical algorithms. The method of using these algorithms was spearheaded by a man named Pierre Bézier. Pierre was a French engineer, and he had an idea. He came up with a way of using de Castelju's algorithms to plot any curve between two or more points, and those curves could in turn be used for any number of industrial applications. He was a leading influence on how CAD and CAM machines work and how 3D models are created, and it's all beside the point. Because vectors are processed in this way, they don't store a finite number of pixels and can be scaled to an infinite size with no pixelation. This means they can be used for something as small as, say, a stamp, to a package like a bottle, to a poster, all the way up to a planet-sized billboard, and you can do it all from the same file. So what does all of this actually mean? Why do we still use bitmaps? Isn't vector just far superior to raster in every way? Well, it is and it isn't. See, vectors and bitmaps are good at different things. Vectors are good at making clean, simple shapes which usually use a limited color palette. They're also perfect for images that need to be scaled, either larger or smaller. Bitmaps, on the other hand, are good at details, usually things like color shifts. They're also far better for sub-48 pixel designs like desktop icons.
Okay, so this is kind of the part of the video that addresses this question directly. But you have to define for yourself, from your own experience of how digital art is used in our culture, when is a vector more advantageous than a raster file, a pixel-based file. So this outlines very clearly what the advantages of vectors are. They're the cleanest type of imagery we can create with a computer. They are best used with clean, simple shapes like line art, right? They are not great at lots and lots of color. So usually vectors have pretty simplistic color. Think logo color, that kind of thing. And they are infinitely scalable. From one file, they can be outputted to any size you want. Rasters are better when you need not just tons of color, but also gradients of color. So when we're doing our setting design or our character design, you don't want to do it as a vector because then it's going to be really chunky in terms of simple shapes and colors, and it's not going to look believable or photorealistic. So for photorealism, for concept art, you definitely want to do raster imagery. All right.
Bitmaps are also how photographs and scans are stored, since it's impossible to capture an image as a vector.
So that's another big point. When you take a digital photo, the only way you can store the information instantaneously is as pixels. Whenever you scan an image into a computer, it can only ever be in pixels. We are going to learn how you can convert pixels to vectors, but there's a lot of creative decisions that have to be made to optimize that. There is no device currently available or made that just captures a vector. It always will capture pixels instead. So vectors have to be created, not captured.
Sometimes you need a complex image. Digital paintings can only work as bitmaps because in a bitmap you have full control over each pixel. Vectors can only store a few pieces of information about the contents of a path. One is the stroke or the outline. The second is the fill, which is the color or the color gradient, which is placed inside the path.
So, I shouldn't have done that. So remember when we did exercise 2, which was kind of our introduction to vector shapes. And we made our emojis, right? That was an example of the limited options we had. You could pick a shape, and then you could fill it with one solid color. And we didn't play with the stroke option, which is where you can outline as well. But those are the 3 aspects you have. You have the shape of the path, the color of it, and the stroke or the outline. But just like we did
Bitmaps
with
work as
exercise
bitmaps
2,
because in a bitmap you have
just like we did with exercise 2, you can layer as many of those simple shapes on top of each other as you need to get your desired image. So I'll go through that again. Vectors are actually very simple digitally.
the contents of a path. One is the stroke or the outline. The second is the fill, which is the color or the color gradient, which is placed inside the path. When you create vector graphics, you're basically accomplishing your goal by doing one of three things: manipulating the stroke, fill, or the shape of the path itself. So you may be asking right about now, if vectors are based on algorithms, does that mean that I have to do math to use them? Well, thanks to Pierre, the answer is no. Manipulating vector shapes is easy and completely math-free.
Not easy.
There's also brush
But
and
it is
pencil
math-free.
tools which can turn natural strokes into vector shapes. Also, just like in a bitmap program, you can use layers and layer groups with vectors. But these are just the basics, so take time to experiment with these programs and learn for yourself.
All right. So there's a lot of new stuff to learn. This student loves vectors, thinks it's easy to manipulate paths, but for most of my students, it's not as intuitive as just making pixels, right? So we will learn it, we will practice it. So here are some other examples. You know, the difference between vector versus raster, pixel-based versus vector-based, on and on and on. So that's in your question of the day. I want you to look at that and answer it by the deadline, which is, I believe, next week. And now we get to our next assignment, assignment 4. This is basically a logo assignment. The end product of this assignment is going to be a black vector shape and then a color variation of your black vector shape. But we also will need to have a refined sketch. So these are the 3 requirements for assignment 4. Sketch, clean black shape vector, color version of the black shape vector. Sketch, clean black shape vector, color version of the black shape vector. Sketch, black shape vector, color version of the black shape vector. But, that's where it gets tricky. I pick a different theme, each semester for this, for students. And sometimes, because vectors are so useful, can be scaled up and are so versatile with the same file, this is the perfect project to use as a service learning opportunity. So we've done Earth Day designs before. We've done campus mascot designs before. We've done stuff for the science building before. This semester, we are doing images for our NLC Veteran Center, which is the building they're building right here and that we have to listen to the construction noises for. So in order to support the Veteran Center, our work will eventually get put, once they've built the building and told us which walls we can design this for, will be put into wall murals within the building. This is done as digital wall films that cover the entire wall, like a customized printed vinyl wallpaper. These are kind of my inspirations for how I'm going to take your projects and put them together into an overall wall film design for the Veteran Center. So what they are composed of are lots of individual symbols. Our military branches, through their history, also are very used to symbolic language and emblems, right? So here I have as inspiration lots and lots of examples of different infantry, signifiers, different branches of the armed services and their use of logos or emblems or designs. I even give you a vector that you can download of this one because it's a really beautiful one you can see that the federal government makes available to us. But your theme for your assignment 4 is just a personal patriotic symbol. So it should relate to you and your interests, but because it's going to get used in the Veteran Center with your permission, it needs to have patriotism as some aspect to it, right? So thinking about whether you are pro the armed services, anti the armed services, I think we can all agree that the people who serve and then retire from